Thank you, Peter. Peter introduced me as a founding partner of PEP. When I actually first got the marketing materials for this event, it actually said foundering partner at Pacific Equity Partners, and I thought maybe Russ knew something that I didn't. You may be a little bit surprised to hear my accent. I am originally from England. Wise upon standing up here talking about the Australian dream. I have lived here actually longer than I lived in England before I left. My children are all Australian. But actually I think the real reason is that when Peter asked me if I'd do this talk, it was the middle of the summer. And I think he got a perverse pleasure out of asking a POM to speak about the Australian dream against the backdrop of the English nightmare that was the Ashes 2013 campaign. So that's part of why I'm here. Let me start by asking us a question today. What is it that we enjoy in life? Is it your home, a place to call your own? Are you keen on sports? Do you enjoy the thrill of playing in a game and then maybe having a few drinks with friends afterwards? Maybe you're a surfer. Maybe it's sitting out the back on a beautiful summer's morning watching the sun come up over the eastern horizon. Maybe it's just the preciousness of very deep friendships. Maybe it's the joy of spending an uninhibited evening with girlfriends, laughing and enjoying their company. Well, there are lots of things that I enjoy. I love my family. I love my children and the challenge of being a father. At a more mundane level, I enjoy a good bottle of wine. And I am a sports person of some description, and I love the thrill of getting out and playing a match of tennis or participating in triathlons. And I've enjoyed the resurgence this season of my English soccer team, Liverpool, who've been playing scintillating soccer and nearly winning the Premiership. So the point is that there's much to enjoy in life, isn't there? There are lots of things that we can celebrate. And yet, we can so often take what's inherently good and spoil it. My enjoyment of a nice bottle of wine can spill over into a habit and then a dependency. My passion for my sporting team can become an obsession, and at the extreme end can result in the sort of aggressive behavior that marred the English or the European soccer industry during the 1980s. And even my love for my children can cause me to idolize them and not to prepare them for the knocks and reversals of life, or indeed on the other end of the spectrum to become resentful of them if they don't live up to the expectations that I subconsciously set for them. And so it is with the Australian dream. The Australian dream was in its original form something that was inherently positive and socially constructive. But in the same way that I've described that good things can be spoiled by the way that we approach them and the way we treat them, this is what we've done to the Aussie dream. And we're going to explore that today. It's become badly distorted. It's become, sadly, a treadmill that we get on almost without knowing it. And so what I want to do today is do three things. One is to ask the question, what is or what was the Australian dream? How has it changed? And why is that? And then I want to look at three ways in which this new version, this modern Australian dream, profoundly affects us both as individuals, but also as a society. And then thirdly, I want to bring some biblical wisdom to bear and explore how the Bible shows us how we can break out of this materialistic dependency, which is at the heart of the modern Australian dream. Well, first then, what is or was the Australian dream? What's it become and why? Well, the idea of the Australian dream goes back to the 1950s, and the icon that's on the screen here is actually very appropriate as we think about the Australian dream. It reflects the neat 1950s nuclear family in their own home. And those are two core parts of what the Australian dream was. It was a response to the deprivations of war. And here is how Wikipedia defines the Australian dream. So I'll just talk on as you read that. But it was a means for government to galvanise the population around a vision for the country post-war. It encompassed both independence and community, and at its heart, indeed, was the notion of home ownership, one's castle, and the classic quarter-acre block, and perhaps the Holden in the driveway. And here are some other images from the era. This is a classic 1950s Australian dream cover. And here is a picture of a couple in Queensland, surveying perhaps their first property purchase. So family, community engagement and nation building were integral parts of the vision. Well, you might have seen at the end of that previous slide that by the 1970s, the dream had started to change already. Aspirations had grown. A quarter-acre block didn't do it anymore, and a single home wasn't sufficient. The dream had expanded to incorporate the holiday house as well. And during the next 40 years, it transformed beyond recognition. Homes became larger. At the same time, as average occupancy declined, meaning that the space per inhabitant ballooned. We now have, on average, the largest homes per capita on the planet. Isn't that an interesting statistic? I didn't know that until I was doing the work on this. And if we can't buy a big enough property, we renovate. And one of my friends is a tennis coach, and he told me the story of a conversation that he overheard between two eight-year-old girls at a Mossman tennis camp. And it went like this. Girl 1, where do you live? Girl 2, we live in an apartment on Raglan Street. Girl 1, an apartment? Are you renovating? And single property ownership seems to be a thing of the past as well. Leave aside holiday properties at the upper end of the socio-demographic spectrum. But Australians are also prolific investment property purchasers, with 8% of the population owning at least one property, and 25% of that group of people owning more than one. And the Holden in the drive has become something more than that. It's become the Lexus and the VW in the double garage, plus the Holden in the drive. We've become extraordinarily focused and very effective collectors of stuff. Well, not only have we become more materialistic, but values have shifted in other ways too. We've become more self-focused. We're encouraged by influences from pop psychologists to marketers to believe that happiness is about fulfilling our dreams. We know some of those ads, don't we? What's the L'Oreal one? Because you're worth it. Or there's an Asian airline which says, it's all about you. These are the messages that we're getting thrown at us all the time. But even the seemingly innocuous phrase self-esteem demonstrates the emphasis that modern society places on how we think about ourselves. We've become quite self-obsessed, and the consequence of this is that we've come to count success as the amount of stuff or the amount of experiences or our level of achievement. It's all about me. And how has this increasingly acquisitive drive been facilitated? Well, we're all aware, aren't we, what happened in the early 2000s. But it was an unprecedented period in history in terms of the growth of debt. Household debt grew from the late 1970s to the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008, sixfold by 6 times. We became debt junkies, and we used it to fuel our desire, particularly for property, but also for other stuff and for experiences. We've become confused, if you like, between want and need. We've convinced ourselves that luxuries are necessities. And it's easy to do, isn't it? We all do it, I do it. And while money itself is inherently a good thing, it facilitates a lot of good things in life. But as the Bible teaches, the love of money, on the other hand, is the root of all kinds of evil. We've come to love money for the security, the status, and the stuff that it buys us. And so the Australian dream, sadly, has become distorted by a kind of corrosive materialism. In their 2005 social commentary, Affluenza, Clive Hamilton and Richard Dennis write this. It's up on the screen. Despite the barrage of advertising that tries to tell us otherwise, the more materialistic we are, the less free we are. Why? Because we must commit more of our lives to working to pay for our material desires. And the more acquisitive we are, the more our desires and the means of satisfying them are determined not by ourselves, but by others. Acquisitive people derive their sense of identity and their imagined place in society from the things they own. Yet, the symbols that confer self-worth and status, are at the whim of external forces, of fashion. Materialism thus robs us of our autonomy. And that's a segue into our second point here, which is, what are some of the manifestations of how, with the Australian dream becoming distorted as it has, how does those affect us both individually but as a society? And we're going to look at three. We're going to look at our work patterns, we're going to look at health, and we're going to look at our relationships. Well, first, let's look at our work patterns. It's interesting, when you look at the top line data, actually average working hours in Australia have gone down over the past 10 years. But you need to be careful, because that's actually a function of the amount of part-time workers who are now in the workforce. So it's important to actually look at the full-time workforce of Australia, and there are some very striking data. We as Australians continue to work some of the longest hours in the developed world. Full-time employees in Australia work an average of 43.2 hours per week. It's one of the highest in the OECD. But then when you strip down beyond that, over 40% of men in full-time employment work more than 45 hours, 30% more than 50 hours, and 15% more than 60 hours. And these proportions have grown significantly over a 20-25 year period. But women are catching up. And over the past 20 years, between 1978 and the mid-2000s, the proportion of women working more than 50 hours doubled. Deferred happiness syndrome. I don't know if you've ever heard of that concept. I think it's something that many of us will be familiar with. It's the concept of sacrificing in the present for future benefit. Mostly, sadly, the sacrifices that are made are centered on relationships with family and friends. A third of our population suffers from this deferred happiness syndrome. And these data aren't surprising, are they? As we loaded up on debt in the 2000s, we've had to start to work harder simply to service that and pay it off. That's our first point, what's happened to work patterns. Secondly, this overwork comes at a significant cost to our mental health. Notably, 1 in 4 workers, 25% of workers, experience workplace stress, with 1 in 10 adults reporting high or very high levels of distress in their lives. 3.3 million Australians suffer from sleep deprivation as a result of work stress. You one of those? I think I am. And as we deal with increased work pressures and financial strain, many turn to one form of medication or another to deal with this. In the mid-2000s, 25% of the working population in Australia admitted to using either alcohol or medication to deal with the stress, and to manage mental well-being. That was 10 years ago. I suspect that number is significantly higher today. And then thirdly, what about our relationships? Inevitably, the cost of working longer hours has a significant impact on the lives of Australian workers and their families. 1 in 5 of the respondents in a recent survey done by the Australia Institute, equating to around 2.3 million Australian workers, report that the impact is moderate or severe on their relationships. In that same report, 50% of respondents said if they work less hours, they would prioritise spending more time with their family. 25% said they would prioritise spending more time with their friends. We're relational beings, aren't we? And we resent having to spend as much time as we do working, when in our heart of hearts we know that actually real joy is found not so much by working long hours, but it's be spending time with family and friends. So, those are some of the impacts that this change in the Australian dream that's taken place over 50 plus years has on different aspects of our lives. So our final point, or our third point, if the Australian dream has become distorted and is having this effect on key aspects of life, this key negative set of negative effects, how do we break out of it? Is there a better dream, a better way to approach life? And this is our third main point. We have to ask ourselves, what lies at the root of the problem? Back in the early 20th century, the Times of London sent a question out, or asked the readers to answer a question, which was effectively, what is wrong with the world? See, in the early 21st century, we're not the only people asking big questions like that. And the writer G.K. Chesterton wrote back, and he wrote back these words, very, very short, but very powerful. He said, "Dear sir, I am yours faithfully, G.K. Chesterton." In other words, he was saying, for all of the great things that mankind's achieved in progressing society, material advances, social advantages, social advances, great technological leaps forward, society's vulnerability lies in the capacity of humanity to take what is inherently good and spoil it. If you like, put it another way, the heart of the problem is the problem of the human heart. I said in my introduction that I wanted now to turn to wisdom from the Bible, and I'll use a story, or as the Bible calls them, a parable, which Jesus is recorded as having taught in Luke's Gospel. In this particular situation, Jesus uses the story to respond to a man who was calling him to intervene in a dispute that he was having with his brother over an inheritance. So here was a man who was overly concerned about what he was going to get, is he wanted to get his fair share. He was focused on material things. Listen to how Jesus responded to him, and I'll just read this short section from Luke's Gospel, and then I'll paraphrase it afterwards. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he, Jesus, said to the man, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, this was the broader crowd, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" So what's Jesus doing here? He's telling the story of a landowner who had great success with his crops. Well, this was obviously an agrarian society, but maybe in metropolitan Sydney, this man would have been a partner of a professional services firm. And the man in the story was thoughtful and wise about how he planned for his business success, and there's nothing wrong with that. He planned for the future, and there's nothing wrong with that either. "If I build bigger barns, I will be able to reap a bigger crop and be secure," effectively, he said to himself. But the clue to his error is both in the text and also in the ultimate judgment that Jesus passes on his attitude. First, in the text, you can't help but notice that in 3 short verses, the man uses the word "I" 6 times. He's very self-oriented. His decisions are all about what is best for me. In our Sydney analogue, he was probably a respected member of the establishment. He was no Jordan Belfort of Wolf of Wall Street infamy. He may well have been active in charitable giving and working on charitable boards, but his primary focus was self-indulgence. See in verse 19, "And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry." And so our Sydney partner had his yacht on Pittwater and his holiday house in Palm Beach, probably had his condo in Whistler. But at the height of his powers, he dies. And look at what Jesus tells his listeners is God's verdict in verse 20. "You fool." Why is Jesus saying this? Here was a man who, in the eyes of the world, had done well. He'd lived respectably. He was admired by many. He'd been wise. He'd retired in good time to enjoy the good things that he'd been able to accumulate. But Jesus' verdict was he was merely a fool. And the verdict here is because he'd not been rich towards God. Well, in the context of Jesus' teachings throughout the Gospels, this is more than just about giving to the needy or to good causes, good as those things are to do. It's much more profound than that. It's about giving God due honor. It's about orienting our lives towards Him, making Him our number one priority. If God is real, and as the Bible asserts, He made us, then making Him our number one priority is terribly important. It's foolish to live lives as if He didn't exist. The really wise thing to do is to seek Him out and to know Him. Well, this man in Jesus' story had lived well in the eyes of the world, no doubt, but he'd ultimately lived for himself. And the judgment that was passed was simple, it was short, and it was very scary. He was a fool. The rich fool, as he's commonly known, had a heart problem. His heart was self-focused. And this is the same condition, the same problem that pervades our society today. It's why the Australian dream, which started out in really quite a promising way, has become distorted with all of the fallout to ourselves and to society that I've described. We've become so self-oriented that we pursue self-gratification to our own material and emotional detriment, yes, but more insidiously and dangerously also to our spiritual detriment. Let me conclude. There's much about the original Australian dream which is commendable, and we've talked about that. But sadly, like so many things which are inherently good, we've spoilt it and caused it to morph into a beast which controls and drives us to acquire, to experience, and to consume well beyond our need. At the heart of this problem is how we've allowed our hearts to become captivated by the god of self. We've created idols which we hope will satisfy our deep needs for security, for status. And the Bible's answer to our problem is that the opposite of the foolishness of living this way is to be rich towards God. That is to acknowledge Him for who He is and to live in relation to Him instead of for ourselves. Well, I wonder if as I've been speaking, you've been mentally ticking off some of the things I've touched on. Long working hours? Tick. Compromising friendships and relationships because of my work? Ouch. Yeah, true. Enjoying more than one or two drinks at the end of the day because actually it does help me relax? Tick. Being focused on that next bonus check because it will allow me to do that much needed renovation? Yep. What can I say if you've been going through that exercise? So did I, as I was going through and as I was preparing this talk. And I've been deeply, deeply challenged at a personal level. I'm guilty in many ways of the very things that we've been discussing. I sometimes work some very long hours. It's often the nature of our business when we're in the sort of thrust of a deal. My travel often, at the moment, has me away from my family for extended periods. I work in a high-stress environment, and I know that that has an impact both on health and also on relationships. I'm patently conscious that some of the choices I'm making are being made not for good reasons, but for the false gods of self and status and security. I'm prone to setting the wrong priorities, to having my heart seduced by the sideshow of stuff. And that's why, as I close, the three questions that I want to leave you with are questions that I've been asking myself and I've been challenged by. What is your heart captivated by? As you reflect honestly on that, where are your priorities? In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus teaches that where our treasure is, there is our heart also. Where is your treasure today? Secondly, how do you respond to Jesus' words to the crowd in that parable, that it's foolishness not to be rich towards God? And finally, will you do something about it? You may be a Christian here today, and I hope that this reminder of the priority of seeking to live your life being rich towards God is both an encouragement but also a challenge. Well, you may be here today just checking things out. You're skeptical or uncertain. Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here. It's great to see you. But more than that, I hope that in the short time that we've had, that you come to see in a small way how the Bible speaks in to our contemporary issues, and particularly how it pinpoints our spiritual deficit. But whatever your starting point, as you come to the discussion today, let me encourage you to come along for the next 3 weeks to these forum talks and hear Al Stewart unpack some of the things that I've only been able to touch on briefly today in much, much more detail. And I expect Peter or Russ will give you a little bit more detail of that towards the end. But I think we've got some time now for questions. So Peter, I'm looking at you. There isn't an easy answer to those things. I think that as you step back and you look at the big picture, the wisdom that Jesus talks about in that story, that the thing that's important to do in one's life is to be rich towards God. I think as you work that through, and this is part of the journey, for someone like myself who's a Christian, and I've been a Christian for many years, and part of the journey of being a Christian is working out in one's own situation what that means to be rich towards God, and then the context that sets for how you make decisions, big decisions and little decisions, how many hours I work, how much time I'm allowing, to spend time with my family, and how to prioritize those things is all part of understanding what it means to live one's life being rich towards God. And there's no simple answer for any one person. It depends on your circumstance. It depends on how you feel you've been gifted to be rich towards God. So I don't think it's an easy question to answer, except at a very high level of principle. Yeah, well, I think that's it is an ongoing challenge to be in an environment and an industry like my industry, which, as Peter says, is it is very much driven around making investment returns, and not allowing that to become a personal stumbling block. The way that I think about our industry is we're about the application of capital, the application of resources to improve the way in which a company works. I mean, in some respects, it's what consultants do, except that we're doing it when we're actually buying the businesses and applying capital to that. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It goes back to to what I was saying before. It is a good thing to take resources in society and allocate them well. The challenge then becomes, as you're sort of alluding to, Peter, is that in that type of business, in that type of industry, at what people call the top end of town, a lot of money gets generated. A lot of money gets generated, and it can become a very, very personally distorting thing. And so for me personally, it's having my wife keeping my feet on the ground. It's having friends who keep me accountable. And one of the ways in which I feel, I'm being put in a fortunate position in which I can be rich towards God is by supporting a number of things through the way in which that what that money can do. I think that the essence of the parable is that, as I said, he was living entirely for himself. It was all about I, and it was all about how he was going to use what he'd been given to eat, drink, and to be merry. As I said, I think that it's very easy to take that parable and say, oh, well, if he'd given more money away, he'd have been fine. That's not the point of what it is to be rich towards God. It's much more, as I said, more fundamental than that. It's about orienting oneself around the God who made us and placing him as the number one priority. How that then works itself out in any of our lives, and in the man's life in the parable, who knows? It may well be that he carried on just doing what he was doing in his farming and building barns and so on, but he used what came out of that in a different way. But most importantly, what Jesus was most concerned about is that he acknowledged who God was and sought to be in a relationship with God. And the point in the story is that that was nowhere near the man's ken. That wasn't what he was about. It was all about what he wanted to do, rather than actually orienting himself away from self towards the God who'd made him. So I think we can speculate as to how he might have been changed had he had that change in orientation. But that's academic. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is to warn us that if we don't live in relationship to God, then we're acting foolishly. Yeah, it's a very good question. In that book Affluenza, the solution that the authors come up with is this idea of downshifting, moving out of an acquisitive, materialistic lifestyle, sort of the sea change thing. Again, I think you go back to the parable and you say, well, actually, that's not what Jesus was getting at. What Jesus was getting at was something much more fundamental, which is we have a heart problem, and our heart needs to be changed. And the way that it needs to be changed is it needs to recognize that we live in a world which is made by God, but we're out of kilter with God. We're out of relationship with him. So I think what Jesus is saying in the parable is, fix the heart problem first. Don't go off down the path of legislating and taking all these different actions. Fix your heart problem first. And then what will come from that, if you fix your heart problem, and you end up having that relationship with God that he wants to have with you, then a lot of this other stuff will become clearer. I'm not saying it's, on day one, it's a bolt of lightning, you say, all my problems are fixed. You talk to anyone who is a Christian, and they have had many reversals. But the fundamental issue that Jesus is getting at in the parable is it's foolishness to live in a world that God made and not to recognize who he is and to be in relationship with him. So I think you have to start there, and then some of the other things follow from that rather than the other way around. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't know how many of you here are parents of young children. I'm a parent of young children. The question was about how, in a place like Sydney, where we're at the pointy end of this sort of affluence and materialism that is so pervasive in the Western world, how do we teach our children that the world in which they live here is not, in so many respects, the real world? I think that's a sort of paraphrase of the question. And it is a problem, isn't it? It is a problem. My wife told me a couple of days ago, our little son William, he collects soccer cards. And I'm pleased to say he's a Liverpool supporter, and he desperately wanted a Luis Suarez 100 Club card. And the whole point of cards is you buy them with a newsagent, you swap them with your mates, you build your teams, and it's great fun. And William came to Rebecca and he said, "Mummy, can I get a Luis Suarez 100 card club on the internet?" And Rebecca said to him, "Sweetheart, that's not how it works. You just buy them in a newsagent and you swap." He said, No, but you can get them on the internet." 2 days later, it transpires, one of William's friends at school he comes on a play date, and he shows Rebecca this card, and he said, "I got this on the internet on eBay. It cost me $40. And it was just such a clear signal and warning that how do you protect your children from that type of just acquisitive, no sense of the meaning of money. I think it's about teaching, but it's also about modeling. I think a lot of parenting is modeling, and I think that's a challenge for us because we, like our children, are living in this bubble, and it's very materialistic and acquisitive. But somehow we need to model the value of things to our children. I think another thing that I'd recommend is, we've tried. I mean, our children are still quite young, but we very much want when we when we can, to take our children to less well-off countries. So our children, we've had the good fortune of going to India with our children. They've seen the poverty in India and parts of South America. And I think that's an important part as well of helping them understand that where we live is something that's a great privilege, and we should be grateful and thankful for it. But let's recognise that there's a very big world out there.
Thank you. Thanks.